12 years. That's how long it's been since I last saw my family, since they decided I was no longer welcome, no longer one of them. I used to count the days, then the months, and eventually I stopped keeping track. But the ache of being cast out never really faded. It just became a part of me. A quiet ache I learned to live with as I built a new life from the ashes of the old. Now, as I stand in the grand foyer of my new home, a place I once only dreamed of, I can't help but marvel at how far I've come. The marble floors gleam beneath my feet, sunlight pours through the tall windows, and for the first time in years, I feel a sense of peace. This mansion isn't just a house. It's a symbol of everything I've survived, every battle I've fought alone. It's proof that I am more than the sum of my family's rejection. I'm still unpacking boxes, arranging furniture, getting used to the echo of my own footsteps in these vast, empty rooms. There's a strange comfort in the solitude, a freedom in knowing that every inch of this space is mine. I've worked for every brick, every beam, every moment of security. And yet, as I set a framed photo on the mantel, a picture of me alone, smiling despite everything, I feel a pang of longing for the family I lost. That's when I hear it. A sharp, insistent knock at the front door. My heart stutters. No one knows I've moved in yet. No one except, well, certainly not them. I freeze, 1,000 questions racing through my mind. Who could it be? I know. After all these years, I never could have imagined what would happen next, or the impossible choice I'd be forced to make. Growing up, my family was everything to me. We weren't wealthy, but our home was always filled with laughter, warmth, and the kind of chaos that only comes from being truly close. My parents believed in hard work, honesty, and loyalty above all else. Sunday dinners were sacred no matter what was happening in our lives. We gathered around the old oak table, passing dishes and stories, teasing each other, and sharing dreams for the future. My siblings and I were inseparable, partners in crime and confidants, always looking out for one another. I used to think nothing could ever break us apart. My mother was the heart of our family, gentle but fierce when it came to protecting her children. My father, though quieter, was the steady anchor we all relied on. He taught me how to ride a bike, how to stand up for myself, and how to keep my promises. I remember the way he'd ruffle my hair and call me his little lion, always telling me I was braver than I believed. My older brother, Mark, was my hero, funny, reckless. I'm always getting into trouble, but he'd take the blame for both of us without hesitation. My younger sister, Emily, was the dreamer, always scribbling stories in her notebook and begging me to play make-believe with her in the backyard. We were a team, a unit, and I never doubted for a second that we'd always be there for each other. But life has a way of testing even the strongest bonds. It started small little disagreements, misunderstandings that festered instead of healing. My parents began to argue more, their voices echoing down the hallway late at night. Money was tight and stress crept in like a slow, relentless tide. I tried to hold us together, to be the peacemaker, but I was just a teenager, ill-equipped for the weight of adult problems. The real fracture came when I made a choice that went against everything my family believed in. I fell in love with someone they didn't approve of, someone from a different background, with dreams that didn't fit their vision for my future. At first, I thought they'd come around. That love would be enough to bridge the gap. But the arguments grew sharper, the silences longer. My mother's eyes, once so full of pride, became cold and distant. My father stopped speaking to me altogether. Mark tried to stay neutral, but even he pulled away, caught between loyalty to me and the pressure to conform. Emily, still so young, watched it all unfold with wide, confused eyes. The day they told me to leave is burned into my memory. My mother's voice was trembling but resolute as she said, "If you walk out that door, don't expect to come back." I remember the way my suitcase felt in my hand, heavier than it should have been, and the way my heart pounded as I stepped onto the porch, the door closing behind me with a finality that echoed through my bones. I waited for someone to call me back, to say it was all a mistake, but the silence was absolute. In the weeks that followed, I tried to reach out, calls, letters, messages left unanswered. Birthdays and holidays passed in a blur of loneliness. The warmth of my childhood was replaced by a cold, aching emptiness. I watched from afar as my family moved on without me, their lives continuing as if I'd never existed. The betrayal cut deeper than I ever thought possible, shattering my trust and forcing me to start over, completely alone. Looking back, I can still feel the sting of that exile. The way it hollowed me out and made me question everything I thought I knew about love and loyalty. But I also know now that it was the beginning of a different kind of journey, one that would test me, break me, and ultimately make me stronger than I ever imagined. And as I stood in my new home on the brink of a new chapter, I couldn't help but wonder if the past was truly behind me or if it was about to come crashing back into my life. The first year after my family banished me was the hardest. I remember waking up in a cramped studio apartment, the kind where you could touch the stove from your bed, and feeling the weight of silence pressing in on me. There were no familiar voices drifting through the walls, no one to ask how my day had been, no one to care if I made it home at night. I tried to fill the emptiness with work, taking on 2 jobs waitressing during the day and cleaning offices at night just to keep the lights on and food in the fridge. Every dollar I earned felt like a small rebellion, proof that I could survive without them. But every night, as I lay awake, staring at the cracked ceiling, I wondered if I'd made a terrible mistake. There were days when the loneliness was so sharp, it felt physical, like a cold hand squeezing my heart. I'd see families laughing together in the park or hear a mother calling her child's name in the grocery store. And the ache would return, raw and relentless. I missed the chaos of my old life, the comfort of knowing I belonged somewhere. Sometimes I'd pick up the phone, my thumb hovering over my mother's number, but I never pressed call. Pride and pain kept me silent. But even in the darkest moments, I refused to give up. I threw myself into my work, determined to prove to myself, if no one else, that I was more than the sum of my family's rejection. I enrolled in night classes at the community college, scraping together tuition with tips and overtime. It wasn't glamorous, but it was mine. Each passing semester, each hard-earned A felt like a tiny victory. I made friends with classmates who, like me, were trying to build something out of nothing. We'd share cheap coffee and stories of our struggles, laughing at our misfortunes and cheering each other on. For the first time, I realized that family could be chosen, not just inherited. Still, the setbacks were relentless. There were months when I had to choose between paying rent and buying groceries, when the car broke down and I walked miles in the rain just to make it to work. I remember one winter when the heat went out and I huddled under layers of blankets, shivering and wondering if anyone would notice if I disappeared. I got sick and had no one to bring me soup or check my fever. I learned to rely on myself, to patch up my own wounds and keep moving forward, even when it felt impossible. Slowly, things began to change. I landed an internship at a small marketing firm thanks to a professor who saw something in me that I'd forgotten was there. The work was demanding, but I threw myself into it, determined to prove my worth. My boss, a tough but fair woman named Linda, became a mentor and, eventually, a friend. She taught me how to navigate office politics, how to stand up for myself in meetings, and how to negotiate for what I deserved. With her encouragement, I started to believe in myself again. As my career took off, so did my confidence. I moved into a better apartment, one with real windows and a view of the city lights. I started saving, investing, dreaming bigger than I ever had before. I built a network of friends and colleagues who became my support system, celebrating my wins and picking me up after my losses. I traveled, tried new things, and discovered parts of myself I never knew existed. I learned that I was capable of more than I'd ever imagined. But no matter how much I achieved, the pain of being cut off from my family never fully faded. Every promotion, every milestone was bittersweet. I'd imagine what it would be like to call my mother and tell her about my new job, to invite my siblings to see my apartment, to share my life with the people who were supposed to love me unconditionally. Instead, I kept my triumphs to myself, tucking them away like secret treasures. The years passed, and with each one, I grew stronger, more independent, but also more guarded. I built walls around my heart, afraid to let anyone get too close, afraid of being hurt again. I told myself I didn't need them, that I was better off alone, but deep down, I longed for reconciliation. for some sign that I still mattered to them. And then, almost without realizing it, I found myself standing on the threshold of a new life. I'd worked my way up to a senior position at the firm, saved enough to buy my own home, a mansion, no less, something I'd once thought was only for other people. As I signed the papers and held the keys in my hand, I felt a surge of pride and disbelief. I'd made it. I'd built a life from nothing, all on my own. But as I moved into my new home, arranging furniture and hanging pictures, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was missing. The success I'd fought so hard for felt hollow without anyone to share it with. I wondered if my family would ever know how far I'd come, if they'd ever care. I told myself I was content, that I didn't need their approval. But the truth was, their absence still haunted me. Little did I know, the past I'd tried so hard to leave behind was about to come crashing back into my life, bringing with it a storm of emotions I thought I'd buried for good. The knock at the door echoed through the marble foyer, sharp and insistent, shattering the quiet I'd grown to cherish. For a moment I stood frozen, my mind racing through possibilities, maybe a neighbor, a delivery, a mistake. But as I approached the door, something in my gut twisted, a strange sense of foreboding that made my hands tremble. I peered through the frosted glass, and my heart nearly stopped. There they were, my family, my mother, standing ramrod straight, her lips pressed into a thin line. My father, older and grayer than I remembered, shifting uncomfortably behind her. Mark, my brother, looking everywhere but at the door, and Emily, my little sister, now a young woman clutching her purse with white-knuckled hands. For a split second, I wondered if I was dreaming. After 12 years of silence, of birthdays and holidays spent alone, unanswered calls and unopened letters, they were here on my doorstep, in the flesh. I opened the door slowly, my heart pounding so loudly I was sure they could hear it. The air between us was thick with everything unsaid, every wound and accusation hanging invisible but heavy. No one spoke at first. We just stared at each other, for ghosts from a life I'd tried so hard to bury. My mother was the first to break the silence. "Hello, sweetheart," she said, her voice brittle as if she'd rehearsed the word but forgotten how it should sound. I searched her face for warmth, for regret, for anything that might explain why they were here now, after all. This time, my father cleared his throat, looking everywhere but at me. Mark shifted from foot to foot, and Emily's eyes glistened with unshed tears. I wanted to slam the door, to scream at them for the years they'd stolen from me, for the nights I'd cried myself to sleep, for the milestones I'd celebrated alone. But I couldn't move. I was rooted to the spot, torn between anger and a desperate, aching hope that maybe, just maybe, they'd come to make things right. We heard you moved here," my father finally said, his voice rough with discomfort. "We thought it was time to talk, too. See you?" He didn't meet my eyes, and I felt a surge of resentment. Where was this concern when I was struggling to survive? Where was this family when I needed them most? Mark tried to smile, but it faltered. "You've done well for yourself," he said, glancing at the grand entryway behind me. "We're proud of you." The word stung more than I expected. Proud? After 12 years of silence, that was all he had to say. Emily stepped forward, her voice trembling. "I missed you," she whispered, and for a moment, I saw the little girl I used to read stories to, the sister I'd sworn to protect. My anger softened just a little, replaced by a wave of sadness for all the years we'd lost. But then my mother spoke again, her tone shifting. "We made mistakes," she said, "but you have to understand, we were trying to protect you. We thought we were doing what was best." Her words landed like stones. Protect me. By cutting me out of their lives. By leaving me to fend for myself. I felt the old wounds reopen, raw and fresh. "You didn't protect me," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "You abandoned me. You left me alone when I needed you most." The confrontation spilled out onto the porch, voices rising and falling, accusations and justifications tumbling over each other. My mother insisted they'd been scared, that they'd acted out of love. My father mumbled apologies, but they felt Hollow, too little, and far too late. Mark tried to play peacemaker, urging us to move past the pain while Emily just cried, her tears silent but devastating. As the argument raged, I felt myself pulled in two directions. Part of me wanted to believe them, to let them in, to pretend. The past could be erased with a few words, but another part, the part that had survived 12 years of loneliness and built a life from nothing, knew that forgiveness wasn't that simple. I'd spent so long building walls to protect myself, and now, with my family standing on my doorstep, I wasn't sure if I was ready or even able to let them back in. The moment stretched, heavy with expectation. They looked at me, waiting for an answer, for a sign that I was willing to open the door not just to my home, but to my heart. I realized, with a jolt, that the choice was mine. I could let them in and risk reopening old wounds, or I could turn them away and protect the fragile peace I'd fought so hard to find. As I stood there, caught between the past and the future, I knew that whatever I decided would change everything. And in that instant, I understood that this was my breaking point, the moment I would finally choose who I wanted to be and what kind of life I wanted to live. The door closed behind them with a soft click, but the echoes of our confrontation lingered in the air, vibrating through the walls of my new home. I stood in the foyer, my back pressed against the cool wood, trying to steady my breath. My hands shook, and my heart felt like it was caught in a vice. I'd imagined this moment 1,000 times, what I'd say if I ever saw them again. How I'd stand tall and unbothered, how I'd make them see the pain they'd caused. But reality was messier, more complicated, and so much heavier than I'd ever prepared for. They hadn't left right away. After the initial shock and accusations, we'd moved into the living room. The four of them perched awkwardly on the edge of my pristine white sofa, their eyes darting around the room as if searching for proof of the life I'd built. My mother's gaze lingered on the family photos I'd chosen to display. Of them included her. My father cleared his throat, trying to fill the silence with small talk about the weather, the neighborhood, anything but the gaping wound between us. But the conversation quickly turned. Old arguments resurfaced, sharper now with the passage of time. My mother insisted she'd only wanted what was best for me, that she'd been afraid I was making a mistake I couldn't come back from. "You were so young," she said, her voice trembling. "We thought we were protecting you from yourself." I wanted to scream at her, to ask how abandoning me could ever be considered protection. My father, usually so stoic, finally spoke up, his voice rough with regret. "We were wrong," he admitted. But the words felt like pebbles tossed into a well too small to fill the emptiness. Mark tried to bridge the gap, his tone pleading. "We all suffered, you know. It wasn't easy for any of us." I looked at him, searching for the brother I'd idolized, but all I saw was a man weighed down by guilt and years of silence. Emily, her eyes red and swollen, reached for my hand. "I missed you every day," she whispered, and for a moment, I almost let myself believe that things could go back to the way they were. But the truth was, I wasn't the same person they'd banished all those years ago. I'd built a life without them, learned to stand on my own, to find joy in my own company. Their sudden reappearance felt like an earthquake, shaking the foundation I'd worked so hard to lay. I wanted closure, yes, but I was terrified of reopening wounds that had only just begun to heal. The contrast between us was stark. They seemed to expect that I'd welcome them back with open arms, that the years of pain and loneliness could be swept away with apologies and promises. But I couldn't ignore the reality of what I'd endured. I remembered the birthdays spent alone, the holidays where I was the only one not invited, the nights I'd cried myself to sleep, wondering what I'd done to deserve their silence. I remembered the pride I'd felt with every small victory, every step forward, and the bitterness that came with knowing they weren't there to see it. As the conversation wore on, my anger flared and faded, replaced by a deep, aching sadness. I wanted to believe that people could change, that time could heal even the deepest wounds. But I also knew that forgiveness wasn't something I could give just because they asked for it. It had to be earned, and I wasn't sure they understood that. After hours of tense conversation, they finally stood to leave. My mother hugged me, her embrace stiff and unfamiliar. My father patted my shoulder, his eyes shining with unshed tears. Mark promised to call, and Emily squeezed my hand one last time. As they walked out the door, I felt a strange mix of relief and loss, as if I'd just closed a chapter I wasn't ready to finish. I wandered through the empty house, the silence now heavier than ever. My mind replayed every word, every look, every unspoken plea. I was torn between the hope that we could find our way back to each other and the fear that letting them in would only lead to more pain. I wanted closure, but I was terrified of being hurt again. That night I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, my thoughts spinning in endless circles. Was it possible to forgive without forgetting? Could I open my heart to them without losing myself in the process? Or was it safer to keep the door closed, to protect the life I'd fought so hard to build? I didn't have the answers, but I knew one thing for certain. Nothing would ever be the same again. And as I drifted into a restless sleep, I couldn't help but wonder what would happen if I chose to let them back in or if I chose to walk away for good. The days that followed their visit felt like walking through fog of rethought, heavy, every decision uncertain. I went through the motions of my new life, but my mind kept circling back to the faces I'd seen on my doorstep, the voices that had once been my world. I replayed our conversations, dissecting every word, every glance, searching for sincerity, for regret, for hope. I'd spent so long building walls to protect myself, and now I was faced with the question I'd avoided for years. Was I ready to let them in, or was I finally strong enough to stand alone? I thought about the boundaries I'd set, the hard-won lessons that had shaped me. I remembered the nights I'd comforted myself, the mornings I'd forced myself out of bed, the victories I'd celebrated in silence. I'd learned to trust my own instincts, to value my own happiness, to recognize that love without respect was just another form of control. My family's absence had taught me resilience, but it had also left scars, reminders of how easily love could turn to pain. One evening, as the sun set behind the tall windows of my living room, I sat with a cup of tea and let myself feel everything: the anger, the longing, the fear, and the hope. I realized that forgiveness wasn't about erasing the past or pretending the hurt never happened. It was about choosing myself, about deciding what I needed to heal and move forward. I didn't owe anyone my peace, not even the people who'd given me life. I picked up my phone and stared at the screen. My family's numbers still saved after all these years. My thumb hovered, my heart pounding. I could call them, invite them back, try to rebuild what we'd lost. Or I could let the silence stand, a boundary that protected the person I'd become. The choice was mine, and for the first time, felt the power in that dot. I decided to write a letter away, to speak my truth without interruption, without the pressure to forgive or forget on anyone else's timeline. I poured out everything I'd held inside: the pain of their absence, the pride in my own survival, the hope that one day we could find a new way forward. I told them I was open to rebuilding, but only if they could respect the boundaries I'd set. I needed honesty, accountability, and time. I needed them to see me not as the child they'd cast out, but as the woman I'd become. As I sealed the envelope, I felt a strange sense of peace. I didn't know how they would respond, or if they would respond at all, but I knew I'd chosen myself, chosen growth over resentment, boundaries over blind forgiveness. I'd opened the door a crack, but I wasn't letting go of everything I'd fought for. What happened next would depend on them as much as me. Would they accept my terms, or would they walk away again? I couldn't predict the outcome, but for the first time, I was okay with that. I'd found my voice, and I wasn't afraid to use it. The future was uncertain, but I was finally ready to face it on my own terms. In the weeks after I sent the letter, life settled into a new rhythm, one marked by cautious hope and a deeper sense of self-respect. I waited, not with desperation, but with a quiet confidence that whatever happened next, I would be okay. The act of writing my truth, of setting clear boundaries, had already shifted something inside me. I no longer felt like the abandoned daughter, desperate for scraps of affection. I felt like a woman who had survived, who had chosen herself, and who was finally free to decide what family meant to her. It took time, but eventually my family responded. The first message came from Emily's simple text that read, "I got your letter. I'm proud of you. I want to try Her words brought tears to my eyes, not because they erased the past, but because they acknowledged it. She didn't ask for instant forgiveness or pretend nothing had happened. Instead, she offered a willingness to rebuild, one step at a time. We started with small things: coffee dates, long walks, honest conversations about what we'd both lost and what we still hoped to find. Our relationship was different now, less about shared history, more about mutual respect and understanding. The wounds were still there, but so was the possibility of healing. Mark reached out next, his message more hesitant. He apologized for his silence, for not standing up for me when it mattered most. "I was scared," he admitted, "and I let you down. I want to do better, if you'll let me." It wasn't easy to hear, but it was honest. We met for lunch, and for the first time, I saw my brother not as the hero of my childhood, but as a flawed, vulnerable man trying to make amends. We laughed, we cried, and we agreed to move forward slowly, with no promises except to keep trying. My parents took longer. My mother sent a letter of her own, filled with apologies and explanations, some of which I was ready to hear, and some I wasn't. She wanted to visit, see my new home, to start over. I agreed, but on my terms. When they arrived, I welcomed them into my house, but I didn't let them sweep the past under the rug. We freely talked about what had happened, about the pain and the lessons learned. There were tears, there was anger, but there was also a sense of release, as if we were finally letting go of the weight we'd all carried for so long. Not everything was perfect. Some days, the old wounds ached, and I wondered if true forgiveness was possible. There were moments when I had to remind myself of my boundaries to protect the peace I'd worked so hard to build. But there was also joy, a real, unexpected joy in discovering that relationships could be rebuilt, not as replicas of the past, but as something new and stronger. The contrast between who I was and who I'd become was stark. I was no longer the girl desperate for approval, willing to shrink herself to fit someone else's expectations. I was a woman who knew her worth, who had learned to stand alone, and who could now choose to let others in, not out of need, but out of love. As I looked around my home filled with light and laughter, I realized that my story wasn't just about loss or betrayal. It was about resilience, about the courage to start over, and about the power of choosing yourself even when it means walking a lonely road. My family and I were still a work in progress, but for the first time, I felt hopeful about the future. I had found strength in my scars, and I knew that whatever came next, I was ready. Looking back, I realized that the greatest gift I ever gave myself was the permission to choose my own path, even when it meant walking it alone. For so long, I believed that family was everything, that their approval defined my worth, that their love was something I had to earn. But the truth is, self-worth comes from within. It's built in the quiet moments when you refuse to give up, in the boundaries you set to protect your peace, and in the courage it takes to demand respect even from those you love most. The journey wasn't easy. There were nights when the loneliness felt unbearable, when I questioned every decision and wondered if I'd ever feel whole again. But each challenge forced me to grow, to discover strengths I never knew I had. I learned that forgiveness isn't about forgetting or excusing the pain. It's about freeing yourself from its hold, about choosing to move forward with or without the people who hurt you. Setting boundaries was the hardest lesson of all. It meant risking rejection, standing firm in my truth, and sometimes saying no to people I desperately wanted to say yes to. But those boundaries became the foundation of my new life. They allowed me to rebuild relationships on my terms, to invite people in without losing myself in the process. If you're listening to my story and see yourself in these words, know this: you are not alone. Your pain is real, but so is your power. You have the right to protect your heart, to demand respect, and to choose the people who deserve a place in your life. Healing is possible even after the deepest betrayals. And sometimes, the family you create is even stronger than the one you were born into. My story isn't over. There will be more challenges, more lessons, and more moments of growth. But I face the future with hope, knowing that I am enough just as I am. And if you're ready to take that first step toward healing, I promise you'll find your strength too. Stay tuned, because the next chapter is just beginning.